The RtValues WebPart is used to display typically current, what we call snapshot data, but sometimes also calculations for specific periods that you can define. Let me take a look briefly at how data flows through the PI system, give you an explanation of what we mean by snapshot data. When new values are introduced into the PI system, they come from a program called an interface. This interface is generally on something we call a data collection node. That's where the interface application runs. The interface is doing what we call an exception-based scanning. We're retrieving data on, say, a frequency of once a second, but we're only passing the values on to the PI system if those values pass something called the exception test. The exception test is a simple deadband. It basically tries to filter out all the line noise. We don't want to be retrieving values over and over again if it simply represents a small amount of line noise, from one temperature transmitter reading to another. The state of equipment nowadays is if you read the same value 10 times in 10 seconds, you'll get 10 different values. They'll be very, very slightly different, but in fact, that's the way most instrumentation works nowadays. So the exception test attempts to filter out all that noise. Now that data that passes the exception test, that goes into the PI server as what we call the snapshot data. Okay? The snapshot data is data that has, as I said, passed the exception test. Now, depending on which version of our buffering subsystem you may be running, we do another test. We either do that test on the PI server or back on the interface collection node, the data collection node. But basically, we do a second test. That second test is going to determine whether the best, most efficient way to store that data on hard drive so that we can reproduce the trend later on. That's something we call the compression test. We use the swinging door compression algorithm, and the result of that is what we end up storing on the PI archives. That's also known as compressed data. Now I go on and on about this because, and we do in most of our classes, because it's important that you know how the data makes it to the system. And when we're talking about the RtValues WebPart, it's important because typically the RtValues WebPart is going to be looking at uncompressed data. In other words, data that has passed the exception test and has made it into the snapshot, but has not gone through the compression test and therefore is definitely going to be stored on the archive. So that's the data that you will typically see in the RtValues WebPart. Now that's just a brief description of how our compression algorithm works, how our data compression works. If you're interested in learning more about it, what I'd suggest you do is go to our main website and take a look at one of our webinars. You can go to worldwideweb.osisoft.com, and then within the links there, go to Events, Webinars, and there's a series called the Show Me How webinar series, and this is the webinar I suggest you take a look at. It's a recorded webinar. You do have to have a support agreement to get to these webinars, but we have a webinar called Tag Tuning Best Practices. It describes in great detail how data compression works. So if you are interested in more information on this, you can go out to, again, our main website, worldwideweb.osisoft.com, and then choose Events, Webinars, and this is part of the Show Me How webinar series. If you're familiar with our rich clients like ProcessBook and DataLink, you can think of the RtValues WebPart as being roughly equivalent to a PI ProcessBook dynamic value, or the current value in DataLink. Or if you're using our system management tools, there's a current values option there, or plugin. All those things are doing the same type of snapshot retrieval. This data, of course, like all PI data, can be updated automatically. So one of the configuration parameters is going to be how frequently it updates, by default every 15 seconds. As you can see, this is what the table looks like, or this WebPart looks like. Just a note real quickly about this right here. This is the current state bar, and if you look at the current state, what you'll notice about it is it shows you the 0 and the span. This is the bottom and the top of the range of the tag, but then in addition it extends up and down from this value right here, which is actually the typical value for the PI tag. So if we take a look at these this right here, at that point that's the typical value, and we extend up and down from that typical value for the bar graph. Now, when you're working with this particular object, the data can be sorted automatically by clicking on the column. So simply click on the column, data set, time, value, etc., and we'll sort by that. You can also open up an ad hoc trend, and there's also an option within the menu to do ad hoc trends of everything on that web part, which we'll take a look at in just a second. Let's take a look. I'm going to go ahead and build one right now. Let me switch over to RT WebParts. I'm going to go into the same menu we've seen before. Under Modify Shared Page, we'll go ahead and add a web part. In this case, the web part's going to be the RtValues WebPart. And I'll drag this over. And I'll go ahead and close out this and start to configure this. Now I'm going to configure this to show the default table arrangement for 4 tags. So I'll choose to modify this shared web part, and I can either do a tag search, or I can go out and just type the tag names in here. I'm going to go ahead and do a tag search here. Look for all the tags that begins with the letters C, D, T. Actually, let's see if I can get all those that just begin with the letter CD. There we go. I think I'll select this and that. I'll go ahead and say OK. And you should see these 2 values now appear, these 2 tags now appear. And I'm going to add 2 more. These are all the tags that begin with the letter SIN. I'll select those and say OK. Now, the appearance of this, of course, is completely configurable. I can go in here and select the which columns I look at, etc. But I'm going to go with the defaults here. Many things here we're going to go with the defaults. For example, with time range, I'm going to go with the standard 15-second update. This time range here is not really that pertinent because in this case we're not looking at trends. We're looking at a single value. Now, if we were to look at things like averages, etc., just to point out something, this time range right here does not affect the summary calculations. That's actually handled through this summary parameters right here, which we'll look at more in just a few minutes. So if I were doing something like averages, that's where I would set that. If I go into table columns, we'll see we get to choose which columns we'd like to use. Let me scroll down a bit here. You can choose which columns you'd like to display. Now I've chosen a standard set of behavior settings, and you can configure your own behavior settings in a configuration page that we'll look at a little later on. But I'm just going to use the standards RT snapshot behavior settings, and these are the things we're going to see: current state, time, value, and data set. And if you wanted to add other things, of course, you could scroll down here and grab those things that you'd like to add and add those to this. Yeah, here's our results. As you can see, we're looking at these 4 values, and on these 4 values we're seeing the current state, the time, the value, and the name of the data set. And if I click on any one of these, you'll notice it immediately brings up an ad hoc trend. Yeah, this is an ad hoc trend of what I had just selected, and what I had just clicked on. And here's another ad hoc trend of sinusoid. And you also have the option, both in edit mode and also when you're in run mode, to go into the drop down and do an ad hoc trend of all the items that were in that RtValues web part. So there's an ad hoc trend from that menu. Now, last thing I wanted to mention is there are some summary parameters that we really have kind of ignored at this point. I'll go back in and modify this. The summary parameters I'm going to use here, I'm going to add here, is an average. I'd like to add an average to this. So if I go into table of columns, I'll go ahead and choose average. I'll move that down, and now it appears in this list. And of course, I can control where these things appear. If I want to scroll this up, put the data set at the very beginning, and then the, for example, the time, and then the average. I can control all that. I think I'd like to do that and put the current state down at the bottom just to show you how flexible this is. Now, you may wonder, well, what are we using for the start time and end time of that average? Well, that's actually something that's controlled by these summary parameters. So if I scroll down again, these are my current summary parameters, 60 minutes interval. This is going to be a fixed interval type. We have moving and running as well. But in this case, that means every 60 minutes, we're going to see a value representing the most recent 60 minutes, starting and ending on the 0 minutes. So this should be, for example, on the hour. I'll go ahead and say OK. We should see. It's as you can see, it's completely reformatted. The reformatting shows me now the average as well as the value. And as I mentioned earlier, if you click on the column headings, we can sort by those column headings. So now I'm sorting by average, now I'm sorting by value. I'll go back to sorting by the data set. One last point, there is an option within here to show that summary information at the bottom. So if I go back here and scroll all the way down, this option right here, display summary settings, if I set that to on, what you'll see is those summary settings will appear in the table or in the web part. So you can see that this is actually for the period. The average that we see is for the period from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock. Now you may have noticed that the RtValues configuration, it has a lot of different options that you can do for the formatting, and we actually haven't even seen the half of it yet. I mean, we just saw what columns are available, etc. There's all kinds of formatting options that are so numerous that, that we actually have a mechanism for storing those as templates. Let me give you an example. I mean, things like the number of rows that are displayed, the columns, the colors, etc. All that stuff is stuff that can be set in a template. So I'll give you an example. Here's what we were looking at earlier. And this is a standard template that ships with RT Web Parts. Here's one that we use in our training. It's called Buckshot. And it's a template that adds a lot more, or many more columns, as you can see. And more importantly, it adds all kinds of formatting. So if you look at this, we've got some time form or some color formatting. We've got a lot more columns. Now, we're going to talk about this in much more detail later on in the class. This is something that's actually set up in a different section of the in what we call RT Baseline Administration. So we'll be talking more about that later on in the class. Now, one other thing, we mentioned it briefly, but remember, when you are working with summary values, you have the option to display those summary settings. So keep that in mind as you're working with summary, with those averages, totalizations, etc. That option down there, as we demonstrated earlier, will show those summary settings on the screen so that your users will know what time the averages and the totals are referring to.